Yes.
Amazing. All right. Let's start. First of all, thank you for everyone who is attending and participating in today's webinar. Thank you also to Susan Schuppli for agreeing to be a part of our Lost and Found Agency series. Those of you who are logging in are sort of joining us from, those few of us on Fogo Island are joining you from a fairly wintry day with quite a lot of snow outside. So it's the perfect opportunity to stay inside and listen to a webinar. But we will begin. My name is Michaela Dixon, and I'm the program coordinator here at Fogo Island Arts. This is the newest talk in our Lost and Found Agency series, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. And our Lost and Found Agency series is a digital talk series, as I've mentioned, that features artists, professionals, and researchers from a variety of disciplines. And those individuals hold a monthly public conversation and a lecture series online. Our events range from formal lectures to informal participatory conversations that encourage exchange in a peer-to-peer learning environment. The Lost and Found Agency thematic engages key thinkers and makers addressing themes pertaining to decolonization, the climate crisis, alternate economies, reciprocity, new forms of democracy, and democratic engagement, migration, and consensus building in the age of fake news, amongst other topics of the participants' choosing. We acknowledge and are thankful for the support of the Canada Council for the Arts today. And today, before I pass it over to Susan, we are excited to have Susan Schuppli here to talk about the World War II weather station Kurt. This presentation focuses on Kurt, which is a World War II automatic weather station installed by the Germans on the Labrador coast in 1943. And that was only officially discovered in the 1980s. I think this is a good moment now to pass it on to you, Susan.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this series. And actually, is that a question already? Can you see or hear me? Okay. So I hope that this will be relatively sort of straightforward in terms of the technology. So let me just get myself sorted. What I wanted to say just by way of introduction was that the opportunity to talk about this weather station comes many years after I found out about it and spent time in the archives of the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa in the summer of 2015, where I also interviewed one of the key figures in this story, Alec Douglas. And I'm going to play a clip, an audio clip from my interview, which is about 4 minutes at some point. So we'll hear Alec talking about the weather station in his own words. But just to say that I was fascinated by this installation that I saw in Ottawa, and that sort of led me on a journey ultimately to find out more about this sort of mysterious technological artifact that had appeared in Canada, in Labrador, which at the time wasn't part of Canada, and that it was in some way, what shall I say, it connects interestingly enough to the work that I'm actually continuing to do. But what I thought I would do in terms of the time today was take you through some of the kind of archival materials related to this particular story, and also delve into the personal archive of Alec Douglas, who kindly shared some of his own slides and photographs that he took on this journey to eventually retrieve this really interesting technological artifact. But I'm going to do this by way of showing images. So I think I will just start my keynote. And I won't have an opportunity to see anybody, but I'm happy to answer any questions. But as I said, it will be a kind of journey through an archive of visual materials, correspondence in particular between two key figures, Franz Selinger and Alec Douglas, and I'll say more about them shortly. So let me just begin. So the story of the Kurt Weather Station, which was a German automatic weather station that was transported on a U-boat 537 it left Germany on September 18th, 1943, and arrived on October 22nd at Martin Bay in northern Labrador. But I wanted to begin with this particular image. And I found this image in the archives, and it just in an envelope with this little black sticker on it that says no charge. And for those of you who may be familiar with the days of analog photography, when one brought in negatives to get printed in the lab, negatives at the end or the beginning of the reel of film sometimes weren't fully, you could push a roll of 35 millimeter film sometimes to take 36, even 37 images, but sometimes they were compromised. And in this case, we see this. I found this image, I stumbled upon this image, and I was very beguiled by it. It was one of these images that had been discarded, that wasn't deemed worthy of significance, yet it's the only image in this entire story of the Kurt Weather Station that actually features a female subject. And this is Donna Andrews, who worked for Transport Canada and actually accompanied the journey to Labrador to retrieve the weather station. So I always found this a very kind of provocative image in the sense that the archives, when you do work in material archives, you find these bits and pieces that enable you to tell stories, but also open up different vantage points into history. And in this case, as I said, I really wanted to focus on the various individuals that are attached to the story of Kurt. And in some way, Donna Andrews remains a very kind of, if you will, she's an overlooked figure in the story. And I did find out more about her eventually by speaking to Alec Douglas. So let me begin. So this is not Labrador, this is the Himalayas, and this is where I've been doing my own research and where we've actually installed a weather station. And so my interest in weather stations isn't—
Sorry, Susan, just to, we can't see your slides at the moment for some reason.
You can't see anything?
No. Can you try maybe stopping to share them and then starting again?
Okay, oh yeah, you should have stopped me ages ago. I went on this long preamble. Okay, let me try again. Share Optima.
Perfect. Now we can see them. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna fast forward. I really apologize. Let me play. Okay, so can everybody see this orange image of Donna Andrew and Alec Douglas? Yes?
Yeah, we can see them.
Okay. And you can see, so I was referring to these images that are sometimes you always get them back because they were part of the reel of 35 millimeter film, even if they were sort of compromised images. And they would put these little black stickers on the photographs that they printed. And so you already heard me talking about this particular photograph, but it's also a kind of beautiful and sort of mysterious image. But this is a glacier that I've been working at Drangdrung Glacier in northern India in Ladakh, where we, in 2021, we installed an automatic weather station. So this practice of installing weather stations to monitor precipitation, rainfall, atmospheric pressure, etc., continues, has a very long history. And it was obviously essential during the Second World War because of the ways in which the winds moved from west to east across the kind of Atlantic. So was very understanding the weather in the Atlantic and in the North Atlantic was really consequential in relationship to the Second World War and the convoys that were moving across the Atlantic from the United States to Europe, and the German U-boats that were also patrolling those waters. But just to say that my interest in weather stations is not only historical, it's also kind of practical. So here are two of the PhD students assisting Farokh Azam, who's installing the weather station, and I'm documenting the process at this point. This is a document from the Royal Canadian Air Force, and it's a daily weather report from Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, marked top secret. And as I said, you can see that the crucial role that weather played both in hampering, say, maritime navigation, but also, of course, assisting potentially with weather systems are in the lingo of military operations. Weather systems are often referred to as they call them force multipliers. They can actually help to disguise positionality of troops on the ground, et cetera. In the case of weather, these kind of weather stations were very important because the remote sensing platforms that we might use today to help with geolocation, and in particular with maritime location and the transmission of signals from responders that are carried on ships today that would ping to satellite from satellite stations to ground control station. None of that technology existed. So these kinds of classified reports were essential to the conduct of the war. So this is just an example of, as I said, of the kind of intrinsic role that weather played. And these documents are very fascinating to go through. And the documents in the Canadian War Museum, as relates to Kurt, there are over 500 of them. So I'm just going to share a very small kind of sample of those documents. These are images that any of you who know this story might actually have seen before. And there's a handful of about 4 or 5 images that were taken by the crew of this German submarine, a U-boat, U-537. And these are images that a German retired Siemens engineer, Franz Selinger, found in Germany. And Franz Selinger worked for Siemens. And Siemens was the company that was actually manufacturing these automated weather stations. And they produced 26 of these weather stations that were installed throughout the Arctic region. So, for example, in Svalbard, in Bergen, Norway, etc., in Greenland and Iceland, but also in North America, specifically the one in Labrador. And so these are the images that were taken during this mission. And there we see one of the engineers on the U-boat actually listening to the signal kind of relay, trying to make sure that the weather station is actually fully operational. Here we see an image that is obviously taken from on the land of the U-boat. So this is when they have landed and they have started to install the weather station. And as I said, these are the images that Franz Selinger found in Germany that convinced him that, yes, indeed, there had been a German weather station installed in Labrador, despite the fact that there was no public knowledge of such a thing, or seemingly, or so the story went at the time. When Franz Selinger tried to investigate and locate all of these different military installations, he drew a blank when it came to North America, because there seemed to be no evidence that this, in fact, had ever been installed. And yet he, through painstaking research, was quite convinced that yes, indeed, this had happened. A weather station had been installed in a remote part of Labrador, and that sent him on a journey where he reached out to various individuals in Canada with the hopes of one day going there and actually seeing the site for himself, and with the objective of ideally of finding the remains of the weather station. And I will continue that line of the story a little bit later. So this is one of the images. This is the image of the installation, and the weather station was painted in a sort of camouflage color to look like rock and snow. And it had a very tall 10-meter mast, which was its antenna and sort of cabling. So this is the way that the weather station looked in 1943 at the time of installation. The weather station ultimately only transmitted signals for about 1 month, and then records indicate that it stopped to, it ceased to function, and there's the archive simply says this might have been due to some sort of radio jamming that was happening in the North Atlantic on the part of the Allies, but its life as a functional or operational weather station was actually quite limited. This is what the weather station site looked like when it was rediscovered in 1981. So, you know, the canisters are still there, but there's a lot of detritus on the ground, and it looks relatively kind of damaged. What I found really interesting about this particular technological history, in going through some of the archival materials, were the fact that there in the records we see a number of mentions, or what I'm calling early sightings, of the weather station. So although in the sort of official military history of Canada, this Kurt is not mentioned until 1981. For example, in 1943, we have this letter here, and it's easier to see here. So we have a sighting that local Inuit communities reported seeing a submarine, at the mouth of the George River. And there's a kind of fairly detailed description here. I'll give everybody a time to read that. It's a bit, see if I can read it. It's hard for me to read because I've got my image is blocking some of the text. So here we have another such sighting, or rather in August of 1943. So in March of 1943, there's a sighting and a report is made. And the report is, as it says, the Navy feels that local, in this case, they say natives, but that local First Nations or Inuit, I believe it would have been Inuit communities they're clearly mistaken. And the same holds true in 1943. That Inuit sealers, in fact, reported seeing a periscope in the harbor. And once again, their sightings, their observations of this event were dismissed. So, which is a very kind of classic story, of course, in terms of like broader questions around who constitutes themselves as a legitimate history or a legitimate witness to history. I've written a book called Material Witness that really delves into all of the different ways in which practices of witnessing are very subject to partisan practices and protocols that really work very actively to determine who and what counts as a witness. And oftentimes this results in the dismissal of, say, indigenous knowledge or indigenous observations. That has a long history when it comes to observations of climatic changes. It's very relatively recent that the knowledge and observations of intergenerational wisdom is included into the field of climate science, for example, which is the area that I most often sort of do research in. So it's not surprising that these early sightings were dismissed as likely fallacious or misrecognitions. In 1977, a geomorphologist stumbles upon the site during the Torngat archaeological survey of Labrador, which two of these were done. And this is the survey that gets produced. It's a project that is run largely by the Smithsonian. And Peter Johnson comes across the remains of this weather station, but assumes it's a kind of remnants of Canadian military kind of infrastructure installation, and doesn't sort of think much more about it. But there's a kind of he does note that in his field records. So it's really much later than in the early 1980s when Franz Selinger is working. He's now retired from Siemens, and he's writing a history of automatic weather stations and trying to locate them. And he reaches out to Dr. Douglas in Ottawa, who is, as it says, the Directorate of History and National Defense, to inquire about the possibility of acquiring maps, possibly images, etc. As I said, he's quite convinced that this exists. We'll go to the next slide. It'll be easier to read. So, dear Dr. Douglas, last year we corresponded about German weather reconnaissance activities in the Arctic, and especially the establishment of German automatic weather reporting station on the Labrador coast during the war. Your efforts did not bring any reports on such an action to daylight, as you told me with your last letter of May 14th, 1980, and the enclosed letter of the Atmospheric Environment Service of your country confirmed. Now, I was researching furthermore the event and was lucky to find some personal reports of crew members of a German U-boat, the established such an automatic weather station off the Labrador coast, and met people who were participating on that expedition. So Hans is typing in English. He's a German speaker, so there's a few little errors. But I do know the exact position but I do not know the exact position due to the lack of a more detailed map of the area to show them. And he goes on, to ask whether he could acquire further materials from Dr. Douglas. He states that the weather station must still exist, as the containers were very strongly constructed. And he wonders whether it would be possible to search that area from a kind of routine cruise of one of the ships of the Coast Guard that might pass the area and find the remains of the station. He also, at this point, says that he would really like to accompany such a voyage should it go further. So this is the beginning of his correspondence with Dr. Douglas. And this correspondence that begins in some way through a very kind of official set of communiques, eventually develops into a very long-standing personal relationship and friendship over many years and decades. So this is another excerpt from one of his letters, and I just wanted to highlight that something that Franz points out in his letter, that the automatic weather station, and he can see this from the documents that he found in Germany. He can see that the weather station with the number 26. So this is the 26, and this is the last one that was made in that series of automatic weather stations, that it had a painted inscription that read Canadian Weather Service, and that this label on the weather station was designed to, in sense, act as a decoy should anyone have come across it. But the reality was that Labrador wasn't in 1943 part of Canada, but B, there's no such agency as the Canadian Weather Service had ever existed. But even when geomorphologist Peter Johnson discovered the remains of the weather station in 1977, he too believed, this is the remains of this military installation, or this belonged to the Canadian Weather Service. So it's that sort of labeling to that act of labeling, of course, actually was in fact quite successful. This is the map that Franz found in the archives in Germany, and he notes the place where the weather station would have been installed, and passes this on to Alec Douglas. Here we have some of the materials from the archives, and this is a document that Franz has put together, and we can see here the timeline for the activities of this particular U-boat. And if we look at the second page, we see that on October 22nd, 1945, Cape Chidley is sighted near the coast. 3 icebergs are sighted. This is where they will eventually land, drop anchor, go with their rubber dinghies, and install the weather station. So Franz was doing this research, and then, of course, typing up his notes, translating them to English, and then sharing them with Dr. Douglas in Canada. I'm going through this very quickly, but just to give you a sense of the kind of material culture, if you will, that surrounds this particular technological kind of artifact. This is an interview I conducted. This is an image of Alec Douglas in 2015, who's, of course, now elderly and retired. And I wanted to play a 4-minute audio clip where he's talking about this event and the ways in which it came about, and in particular highlighting his relationship to Franz Selinger and the ways in which the story of the current weather station comes to our public attention. So let me just play that audio clip. I do hope that it works for everybody.
And in 1943, it was evident that they would need evidence or need forecasts from the Western Atlantic so that they could forecast what the weather was going to be over the Channel in the case of Allied invasion of Northwest Europe. Well, they consequently sent out a submarine, U-537, and had them set up a weather station in Labrador, the north coast of Labrador. And the Allies knew nothing of this weather station. Fortunately for them, the communications from the weather station were very poor, and they didn't really provide much information to the Germans. And they decided to send out a second one the next year, but the submarine sending it out was sunk en route, so the Germans had no active weather station on the Western Atlantic. However, the remains of this weather station, it was still working, and it was still sending out its signals, but they were not reaching submarine U-boat headquarters in Europe. In 1980, I received a letter from Franz Selinger, who was a German, as I said, working in the industry that produced these weather stations during the war. And he was writing a history of the weather stations, and he knew that there had been one in North America, but he had not been able to locate it. And he asked us if we could tell him. Well, we knew nothing about it either. So we said, we're very sorry, we know of no German installation in Canada or Newfoundland during the war, only in Greenland and Iceland. And so he went to work with the U-boat diaries, and he finally discovered that U-537 had in fact brought an automatic weather station and installed it in a bay in northern Labrador, just south of Cape Chidley, Martin Bay, and that it probably should still be there. Well, I was very intrigued, and I managed to get permission to go up with him to look for this weather station. The Navy wouldn't take me, they couldn't spare the ships to do it. But the Coast Guard, fortunately, sending its ships every year up to the Arctic, was headed up by J.Y. Clark, who was an old shipmate of mine. And he arranged for Franz Selinger and I to travel in the Coast Guard icebreaker up the Labrador coast and to see if we could find the weather station. There's quite a story to getting on board the icebreaker and getting to Halifax and up the coast and so forth. It was a delightful holiday as far as I was concerned. And when we got off Martin Bay, the captain, Captain Tanner, who was a very old-fashioned captain and very cautious, anchored well offshore because he wasn't sure what the water was like close in, and flew us in by helicopter into Martin Bay. And the helicopter did several passes over where we thought the weather station had been. The first time we could see nothing, and he said he'd try a little lower. The helicopter pilot was a chap named Les Bennett from Nova Scotia, Les Bennett from Nova Scotia. And so he took us on the second run, and we saw the ruins of the weather station lying on the ground, like this.
Oops, okay. So there we're hearing Dr. Douglas talk about this experience in his own words. And so in the summer of 1981, Franz Selinger is invited to come to Canada, flies to Canada, and joins Alec Douglas and Donna Andrew on the Coast Guard icebreaker to go and see whether there in fact are still the remains of this weather station there. And this is just a copy of the telex, in fact, that he received. These are images that Alec Douglas took and shared with me of the journey. He actually took, it seemed like hundreds of images of icebergs, but I'll just share a few. So this is in July of 1981, making their way to Martin Bay. Getting very close to where they will eventually anchor the boat. And yeah, as he said, they needed to, of course, take a helicopter to make their way inland, because yes, it is extremely treacherous, as you can see. this is now on the ground. Actually, I don't even know what that those chunks of wood are actually have some sort of message or something. These are just more of the images that Alec Douglas took that summer. And this is an image from the site of the weather station looking back out. And this is what they found. Sure enough, the rusted remains of this World War II weather station were still there, largely intact. And although most of the cylindrical kind of barrels were lying on the ground, they reassembled them because they had original drawings of what in the original photographs. So they took it upon themselves to try and reassemble the weather station. The cabling that would have held up the antennas that had long since disappeared. But these are really the only images that actually remain that show the weather station in situ. There we see Donna and a few other people, presumably from the Coast Guard. And this is actually a diary entry from Alec Douglas. During this expedition, he also recorded all of his reflections and thoughts in a daily kind of diary. And when I inquired about the woman in the photograph, he went and looked through his diary entries to find what he had written about Donna. And so I just include this to give you a sense of the kind of different materials that one can find in the archives. So now the archives in Ottawa also contain the diary notations of Alec Douglas. Back on the ground, we see some of the sort of bits and pieces of this weather station in their kind of rusted state. What's going to become quite critical and quite contentious is the fact that this historical artifact, if you will, should it remain in situ on site as a kind of monument, as a kind of historical kind of reference point. The decision was made, no, it would not remain on site, even though it had been there since 1943, but that it would actually be removed. And eventually it would make its way to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, and that is where I actually first encountered it. And this actually becomes quite contentious, and there's quite a bit of a campaign that starts to begin in relationship to the question of whether this should actually be removed from its situation in this sort of outdoor landscape where or does it become a museological kind of artifact? Here's some of the shots from the helicopter as they're leaving the site. And this is then what appears this is the Ottawa Citizen, August 1st, 1981. And of course, when the discovery of this weather station took place that summer, it became quite a kind of dramatic story and was always discussed in terms of like Nazis invade Canada, that was the ways in which that was the kind of spin that was oftentimes placed on this discovery of this weather station in the kind of popular kind of press. Oops, what happened there? And yeah, here's another image. We have an image of it being airlifted. So a couple more letters from Franz that he's written to Dr. Douglas that are in the archives. These are now, this is just after, this is September 1981. So they traveled there in July, and then in another letter in October 1981. And if you read through these letters, you start to realize that the story of the weather station is not over. France is now on a mission to find all of the different component parts that comprise the weather station, and all of the different instrument manufacturers, all of whom would have been in Germany. Many of them still existed, and he's starting to look for transmitters, receivers, instruments, etc., antenna, and he wants to tell the complete kind of technological story of these weather stations. So he's keeping Dr. Douglas very kind of apprised of his sort of research into, and it will take him into, he goes to Longyearbyen and Svalbard. He travels to all of these different manufacturers, and also places where the weather station would have been installed. So the two that were installed in Norway and Bergen and Longyearbyen in Svalbard, they also offer him clues as to the kind of technology they comprised, and allow him to do further investigation, which also helps to illuminate the case of the Kurt weather station, of course. But as I said, the removal of the weather station was not without controversy. So here we have the dean at Carleton University writing, and he says, "I note that you have urged strongly preservation of the artifacts you found for museum purposes, but I gather you have suggested that they be moved from the site. Since this is contrary to all contemporary museological principles, I'm toying with the idea of suggesting the Chief of Defense Staff that a museum be established in situ, and that you be appointed its first all-weather curator." So he's writing this to Dr. Douglas. So a debate is now emerging in relationship to the removal of this this historical artifact. More correspondence along that line. This is from, obviously, as it says, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. The weather station belongs to the province, but they make the decision to loan it on permanent loan to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. This is a letter that is sent in 1983, where Alan Ruffman has proposed that the weather station be nominated as a historic site with the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. So let me just read this letter. It's very short. Your readers may remember that after the 1981 relocation of the 1943 German self-contained covert weather station on the Hutton Peninsula at Martin Bay, Labrador, apparently the only one the U-boats ever installed on North American soil, I nominated the site as an historic site with the Historic Sites and Monument Board of Canada. That suggestion was, I believe, supported by a number of other parties, perhaps expressing concern in the face of the removal of all of the remaining equipment to Ottawa, apparently for restoration. While normally the rejection of such a nomination would not be news, it may be of interest to your readers to read the actual words of the board's June 1982 recommendation in Saskatoon, quoted below, exactly from a November 30th, 1982 letter from Henri Tutu, secretary to the board. Quote, the weather station installed on the Labrador coast in 1943 by the Germans is not of national historic significance. I suppose one might wonder if Ottawa would ever consider anything on the coast of Labrador of national significance. unless it was gas or oil, and that they have not as of yet figured out how to remove to Ottawa, though they're working on it. Yours truly, Alan Ruffman. So this is the weather station today, as it is presented to the public in Ottawa. Decision was made to refurbish it, so to remove all of the dust, to remove any kind of traces of its material history on site, and to place it in this completely, I guess, rather kind of strange looking configuration inside the Canadian War Museum. And I can understand all of the contestations that emerged in the aftermath of its rediscovery and removal. And here we have also, this is, as I said, this is the reference to the labeling that was used as a kind of decoy. So the Canadian Meteor Service, that this is, they also repainted that, of course. And then I wanted to allow enough time for questions, just another few documents from the archives. So, so just to say that once again, it's just to mention that Franz is still sniffing along various lines. He's asked whether he'd be prepared to purchase a Lorenz radio transmitter if he can locate one by advertising. You may be interested to know that he has now obtained proof of a second weather station sent out in U-867 for Labrador, but lost when the U-boat was sunk late in 1944. In fact, the story of the U-boat, U-537, it was eventually sunk with all hands in 1944, in November of 1944. So that same U-boat that traversed the Atlantic with the crew and installed the weather station, a year later would disappear entirely, sunk by the Allies. The correspondence with Alec and Franz continues. They write about the weather station. They write an article for National Geographic. If you were to go through the archives and review all of the correspondence between these two men, you also start to see personal anecdotes start to intervene into this what initially was official correspondence, and sort of what one might characterize as more kind of organized around fact-finding missions. They start to also send each other small gifts, memorabilia, talk about their vacations, etc. Other news events such as the war in Lebanon are mentioned. So there's a lot of there's something very fascinating about this relationship that evolves to eventually become a highly kind of personal relationship, or at least that's the way that becomes a significant friendship, rather, I think is perhaps the better way to kind of characterize that. And here are a couple of postcards that Franz, I'm going to end with these. These are postcards that Franz Selinger sends to Alex as he's continuing his journey, one from Spitsbergen, which is the main island in the Svalbard Arctic archipelago, and another one from Norway, where he's continuing to try and track down the locations of these different weather stations. So just to give you a sense, I'm going to stop screen sharing. I just wanted to give you a sense of how I think it's really important that when we're looking and delving into these historical archives, to try and have a sense of who are the people and communities that become part of these stories, and to in some way, I'm always interested in the sort of expansion of the kind of narrative. And so in some way, these kinds of technological objects become also devices for storytelling, I think. And one can, start to read you can read sort of, obviously one can read a certain kind of geopolitical story. You start to understand these, as I said, contestations or debates that are also bringing like questions of museums, commemoration. What are the ways in which should history remain in situ, or should the historical artifacts of conflict be removed to other sites for where maybe other more reflective or reflective sites? In the case of the Kurt weather station, of course, it's in an extremely remote, and actually it's a very difficult area to access. I was very keen to do so myself, but one really would have to go, I think, by sailboat. I think it's not somewhere one could go very easily. But so this just gives you a sense, I think, of the materials that exist in the Canadian War Museum archive, and that in some way, I think, open up the story of Kurt in, I think, really in kind of more interesting ways. And I say that just because if you encounter those objects in the museum, as we saw in that one particular image, you don't really have access to the kind of rich textured history that's a part of that is a part of that event, and the stories that one can tell that are very much at the heart of that. So maybe I leave it there so we have a few minutes for questions. I hope
that would be great. Thank you so much, Susan. I have one question for you. Would you mind making me host so I can turn on my video again?
Yeah, how do I do that?
You see there should be like 3 dots right beside the info at Fogo Island Arts. If you click, when you like put your cursor on top of the image, and then if you click the 3 dots, it'll say make host.
Beside my image?
No, beside the info at Fogo Island Arts image.
Oh, I see. No, I just have, sorry, I don't, weirdly enough, I can't see that. That info at fogoislandarts.ca is just big on my screen. There's no 3 dots beside it.
If you put your cursor over to the top of the just info at Fogo Island Arts, you should see in the top right corner a thing that says mute and then 3 dots in blue. Do you see them?
No.
Okay.
I never, can you, sorry. Let's just, yeah.
Well, then we can go ahead, I think, just like with me on, just like this.
I think, let me see if I can attendee view, hide self view, I'll go to gallery. No, I'm sorry, I don't see. Okay, this is, yes, now I see this. Okay, make host. Okay.
Perfect. Amazing. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much for that incredibly insightful talk. It's really interesting, I think, for those of us, obviously, who live in Newfoundland and Labrador, but those of us who don't as well, to understand that history, especially as it pertains to Labrador Place. I think that was that Alan Ruffman sort of interestingly maybe dug at, which is that the interest, I think, in Labrador is really related to natural resources and really very little about its geopolitical history, which is incredibly interesting and sort of a conversation that is developing a lot more today, really, than in, let's say, history as we understand it. Mm-hmm. There's a question in the chat that I think came up for me as well, which is, why was it called Kurt, the weather station?
Oh yeah, that's because the main radio engineer, that was his first name.
Okay. The German.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's probably not, I mean, that's its sort of, let's say, vernacular name, but it was just, I guess, maybe, I don't know if they did that for, presumably not all of them, but anyway, it was Kurt Sonnemeyer was his name. And we saw an image of him with the headphones and the sort of antenna. Yeah.
Amazing. Another question by one of my colleagues, Amy, is, were the sightings by the local residents investigated at all at the time they were reported? One would think that the stakes were high enough to justify some sort of action, no matter how strong the colonial bias is at play.
No, nothing, not that I have. I only found these sort of incidental comments in sort of passing, because the other thing, in the archives, there's a lot of there's correspondence with the Americans, and the American also the about it's mentioned to the Americans that this might exist, and the Americans also say, well, that seems highly improbable, this kind of thing. So there's also, and the Canadians are wanting to share classified information, and so the US Navy is going, we're not really interested. So there's also a kind of like, there's a kind of double, there's a sort of double negation that happens. Both you have the kind of local observations that are being, the local observations are being negated. There was also these Moravian priests that saw something. So it's coming up in a lot of different kind of accounts. All of them are seen as like people, they must be seeing things, or they obviously saw something else. And when it's reported to the US Naval Command as well, they're saying that, you know, there's not really, they're not particularly interested in sort of following up on anything, and they feel that all of kind of information sharing between the two nations about like classified military intelligence is already sufficient, and they don't see any need to sort of open up sort of further kind of inquiries. But also, I suppose at this point, it's sort of late in the war, and the Allies have been very successful in taking out German convoys. Or not, no, the U-boats are trying to take out the convoys that are moving across the Atlantic, but the casualty rate is quite high on the part of the U-boats. So I think the war is also sort of shifting. So I don't know if in 1943, I don't know more than that and why it would have been disregarded. I think maybe just because it seems so improbable that the Germans were this far over, even though Iceland and Greenland aren't that far either. So there sort of just seem to be less kind of I'm not a naval historian or a historian of the war, but I wonder what the interest in looking at the Arctic was at that time in general. I don't really know, nor let's say more of the kind of northern geographies. Yeah.
Thank you. A question from Jamie is there anything currently at the site in Northern Labrador marking / acknowledging the site? And then a second question sort of to follow up on it from Jamie is also interested to know how the station was powered.
Oh, so it's powered by batteries. And so this is the problem with these automated weather stations. The batteries would last for about 6 months, but they would need to be replaced. So all of the weather stations that were installed, that would be something that would then involve ongoing maintenance repair. And so similarly to the mini weather station that we installed at Drangdrung Glacier, that also runs on batteries. So there's really, you could not, at least in most contexts, if you want continuous acquisition of data, which is what you need, then you can't really rely on solar power, even like today. So these weather stations are run on batteries, and they need to be kind of replaced. So it's one of the sort of challenges. COVID presented a huge challenge for a lot of field scientists in that regard, because downloading data and replacing batteries, which would be part of annual field work practices, didn't happen. So there are these data gaps. So that's the sort of answer to the second one. And what the first part was,
First part was, is there anything, yeah, sort of marking that it existed, I guess, in Northern Labrador?
not since, I haven't done much research since, for the past couple of years, but as far as I know, the answer is sort of no.
Yeah. Wow. And a question from Keith. Sorry, is it appears that Mr. Selinger sent Dr. Douglas some technical information about how the weather stations encoded the readings and sent them by Morse code. Did you encounter this information during your research, and do you know where it might be available?
No, I don't, but it'd be worth asking Dr. Douglas, because he's still a very lively and engaged man, but that material wasn't in the archives. At one point, I wanted to make a small documentary with Dr. Douglas, and the project sort of stalled. And so, as I said, there's these 500 documents that I've scanned when I was in the archives, and they're largely kind of text-based. So I think there's a really interesting story to be kind of teased out, and also to understand more about the technical kind of aspects of like the frequencies, the kind of rate of transmission. I mean, we know some of that, but I think what the person is asking, I think, is super kind of interesting. And where that would be logged, I guess somewhere in the Department of Defense, I suppose, or National Defense. It definitely wasn't in the archive, because it's the one, I'm a sort of technophile, and I would have absolutely gravitated towards it. That's why I was very keen when I was looking at the negatives of that image. As I said, those kinds of techno. They're more, for me, they're the kind of technical. Sometimes it's the information you find on the margins or the periphery that can allow you to enter into a field of research differently, and just finding a certain kind of, like, who is Donna? What was her role? Why was she there? Etc. There's another thread that can be pulled that maybe would sort of reframe a story or an event differently. So I think the Morse code would also be another kind of thread that one could pull, and that would be super interesting.
Yeah, very. Kenna has a question about the fact that the artifacts were cleaned up, which I do think is a really compelling aspect of this presentation in general. She writes, I find it very interesting that the artifacts were cleaned up and presented with so little context to share to people who might be interested. Does the War Museum in Ottawa understand that its actions leave the history so uninteresting to Canadians who might take the time to visit the museum?
I mean, I completely agree, because in some way, if my mother lives in Ottawa, so I do go there relatively frequently, because it is a museum that it's not that old, but it's really made a lot of efforts to create the kind of experiential encounter for viewers. It's part of the ways in which a lot of historical museums are trying to animate the materials they have and put them in a broader socio-political kind of context. But then you get into that part of the museum where they have a lot of jeeps, tanks, basically just machines, artillery, etc. And it's just there. So it's completely kind of decontextualized. And I think there's in some way, it's a huge, I think it's a missed opportunity to tell a very different kind of story, but also in relationship to the role, I think the role of weather, the ways in stories around technology infrastructures, and to also create a kind of, to also, I think, establish its kind of contemporary kind of relevance, because our lives, at least in, I'm not living in Canada right now, but I mean, our lives are completely contingent in many, many contexts with these technological infrastructures of telecommunications. And so it's just, and these have very, they have very rich and lively kind of histories, and this is sort of one of them, right? So it's in some way, how would we also denaturalize our contemporary technological condition to understand the sort of longer histories of, and these histories in almost every case, the research and development comes out of, as I'm stating the obvious, but it usually comes out of some sort of military technology first, or that's often the sort of case. So I think there's a way that you could establish its contemporary relevance, and it's not simply by telling the story of Kurt, but to understand the ways in which technology, transmission, weather, all of the, are the sort of whole field. How would you understand these kinds of conflicts through also understanding the ways in which environmental systems, for example, are crucial to the ways in which conflicts unfolded, right? And managing environmental sort of systems.
Definitely. I mean, I'm from Ottawa. I know some of the people who are here are as well, or are currently living in Ottawa. So I'm very familiar with the Canadian War Museum. And as a teenager, I think the only thing that, now, so reflecting on when I was a teenager, which is 10 years ago, I remember, I think out of all things I remember in the War Museum, the thing I remember the most would be probably the vehicle that they have, that they say Hitler was in at some point, which is, I get, obviously quite like but there's a lot of sort of extra attention, also kind of like spectacle around those kind of, objects, let's say, for lack of a better term. A question from Kitty is, I was thinking about the film 49th Parallel, where the Nazis land in northern Quebec or Labrador and make their way across Canada. Have you thought about the film in relation to these findings? Thanks for the great talk.
No, that's a great, actually, reference. And in some way, though, I think, Michaela, it links to what you were just talking about because I was interested in this not because it's a Nazi sort of artifact, and this sort of the ways in which that becomes like a supercharged kind of like object because of its proximity to like evil, if we wanted to. And there's something about, and that was in some way this, and also that's, I showed that it's sort of Ottawa Citizen with its front page in August of 1981. In some way, I wanted to sort of kind of avoid or not de-emphasize that dimension of the sort of story. And like if I had more time, like reading the correspondences, I just found incredibly fascinating because it's, as I said, because the ways in which a certain kind of perfunctory communication becomes a kind of friendship. So I actually thought that I was more interested in the weather station in that context, rather than its sort of like Nazi sort of origins. But I haven't seen the 49th Parallel. I've just seen the 45th Parallel by Lawrence Abu-Hamdan. That's nothing. It has no relationship.
I have also not seen the 49th Parallel, but I'm interested to do so after this.
Yeah, no, definitely.
There's a question from Edward. It reads, I see links to the Viking findings in Labrador across from St. Anthony. As far as how to treat remnants of a site from a historical perspective, your thoughts?
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting that there's somehow that the Kurt weather station as a human manufactured artifact is treated differently than the sort of Viking remains, which are also, coming out of human activities, right? And so there's something about this I mean, I think it's an interesting point to kind of ponder on. Is it like, does it, because it has a different seemingly kind of technological, it's, it has a different sort of technological valence, but in fact, it's really wrong to think in those like terms. So why does this sort of more mechanical, technical sort of device end up in the museum, and other kinds of remains that also come out of feats of human engineering that are much more ancient remain in kind of place? I think part of it was the other letter, the letter that talks about the fact that or maybe was it Alan Ruffman's, where it's not really seen as it's just a kind of object of curiosity more than something that of significant historical value. I don't know, but I mean, I think they could easily have left it there because it's not a site where very few people will ever can go there, and it could have been well documented, etc., and that could have been in the museum and probably would have been sufficient. But other cultural materials, there would be very like strident prohibitions against altering them in any way. So like even in design museums, like a very famous chair will never be reupholstered. You have to keep it in its original kind of used state because that's part of the patina of history or something. So I'd like to know more about the ways in which the War Museum, like why that decision was made to alter a historical kind of artifact. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to leave it with Carol's comment and then we'll wrap up. Carol writes, I suppose that in wartime, the only interest would be in locating the U-boats. After all, you said it was only functional for a short time. Absolutely. I mean, we'd like to, thank Susan, thank everybody for attending this talk. It's been really, really interesting to all of us, like I said before, who live in Newfoundland and abroad. It sort of contextualizes a really interesting aspect of our very recent history that we might consider was a long time ago, but really is not. Our next digital talk is taking place on March 25th, so please subscribe and keep paying attention, and we'll send out those details shortly with artist Paul Colling. Thank you all. We really appreciate you joining us on this Saturday. Susan will speak shortly. I just sent the information to your email, but.
Okay, and can I just say to everybody who's online, if they're still there, it was a bit of a whirlwind through my archives, and if I've gotten anything wrong or you have more information, please drop me an email. Because as I said, it's been a while since I've sort of engaged with these materials. So, maybe there's something that people are aware of, because I do know there's a lot of people who've delved into the history of the history of Kurt and may have far more information or knowledge than I have. So anyway, if anyone wants to email me, I'm happy to receive that email. And such as the person who had the information about the Morse code exchange. So I'm guessing that there might be things that I've said that I hope I was accurate, but you never know. It was a bit of a whirlwind truth through my materials. So I'm happy to be corrected as well. If anyone can shed light on some of the things, for example, is there something there now acknowledging that history? I'm not aware of it, but maybe others are.
Yeah. Well, thank you all again. I'll talk to you shortly, Susan, and enjoy the rest of your Saturday, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah.